when the Galactic Council saw humanity activate Predator mode. Part 1. The incident at Verath Station. Nobody was paying attention to the humans. That was the mistake. That would always be the mistake. Sci-Fi had been stationed at Verath Council Observation Post for 6 years. She had watched 11 species make formal contact with the Galactic Council in that time. She had filed reports on territorial disputes, trade violations, and 3 separate incidents involving a species called the Duvari who believed paperwork was optional. She had eaten the same cold meal every Tuesday cycle, and had never once considered that a Tuesday could become the kind of day that ends a career, upends a century of doctrine, and follows you into sleep for the rest of your life. It was a Tuesday. The distress signal from the colony vessel Arden's crossing came in at 4:12 station time. Sci-Fi was already at her desk. She was always already at her desk. The signal was a standard civilian emergency broadcast, the kind the automated triage system rated low priority. 1,700 passengers, 1 vessel. The Keth raiding fleet intercepting it numbered 12 ships. 12 ships against 1 unarmed colony transport. The Council Peacekeeping Dispatch Protocol calculated a 48-hour response window. That was considered fast. That was considered, among the 41 species of the Galactic Council, an example of institutional efficiency at its finest. Sci-Fi began preparing the standard incident form. She was on the 3rd field when the human response channel opened. She looked at the timestamp. 11 minutes had passed since the distress signal. She set down her filing tool. The human response was not a peacekeeping vessel. It was not a diplomatic ship. The registry listed it as a patrol craft, mid-class, assigned to the Outer Reach Corridor. It had been 22 light minutes away when the signal broadcast. The math on that made Sci-Fi pause. She ran it twice. The ship had been moving toward the Arden's crossing before the signal finished transmitting. She pulled the visual feed. Her translator began producing errors within 30 seconds, not because the language was difficult. The humans were not speaking to anyone. The errors were coming from the tactical notation overlay, a council standard behavioral analysis program that categorized fleet response patterns by known doctrine. It had 60,000 documented entries covering every spacefaring species in the galactic registry. It kept returning a single output, no match found. The 12 Keth ships had formed a standard raider encirclement around the Arden's crossing. Sci-Fi had seen this configuration before. It was textbook. Hold the target, present force, extract what you want. The Keth were not a sophisticated species, but they were consistent. She had watched them run this same pattern against 4 other vessels in the past 18 months. The human patrol craft did not approach the Arden's crossing. It went around it. It moved to the far edge of the Keth formation to the single ship positioned as rear guard. Sci-Fi watched the Keth rear guard fire. The human ship moved, not evaded, moved the way something moves when it already knows where the shot is going. It responded once, a single precise strike, and the Keth rear guard went dark. Then it went to the next one. Sci-Fi's hand was over the emergency alert panel, without her deciding to put it there. The human ship did not fight the Keth fleet. It was more accurate to say it worked through it, moving from the outside of the formation inward, cutting the encirclement apart ship by ship before any of the remaining vessels could regroup into a new configuration. Each time a Keth ship repositioned, the human craft had already adjusted. It was not reacting. It was not defending the Arden's crossing. It had simply decided how the engagement would end before it began. 23 minutes after arriving on scene, 11 of the 12 Keth ships were disabled and drifting, not destroyed. The distinction would bother Sci-Fi for weeks before she understood why. The 12th ship was running. The human craft pursued it for 9 minutes, exactly long enough to herd it out of the system, and then turned back. The Arden's crossing transmitted a thank you message. The human patrol craft acknowledged it in 4 words. Sci-Fi's translator rendered them as, "Copy that, moving on." Moving on. Siveth sat at her desk for a long time after the feed ended. Her cold meal was still beside her. She had not touched it. Outside the observation port, Verath Station hummed along as it always did, bureaucratic and endless and completely unchanged, as if nothing had just happened that required changing. She pulled up the Council Behavioral Registry entry on humans. She had read it before. Most observers had. Humans were classified as a Grade 3 emerging species, noted for moderate technological development, significant internal conflict history, and a temperament profile that rated them as cautious, community-oriented, and non-expansionist. The profile had been compiled 60 years ago from long-range atmospheric observation and intercepted communications. It had never been updated. She read the temperament section twice. Cautious. She looked at the feed timestamp, 11 minutes. She looked at the tactical overlay, still cycling through its database, still returning no match found. She opened a new report to the High Chamber. The subject field asked for a brief summary of the incident. She sat with her fingers over the input surface for a long time, looking for the right words in any of the 14 languages she spoke fluently, and found that none of them had quite the right word for what she had watched. She typed in her own native tongue, the closest thing she could find. They changed. She sent it. Then she sat back in her chair, looked at the empty feed screen, and thought about the 12th Keth ship, the one that was allowed to run. She thought about the fact that the human craft could have disabled it. The engagement pattern made that obvious. It had disabled 11 vessels in 23 minutes with a precision that suggested it had not been working at full effort. It let one go. As Siveth, 4 centuries old, who had watched species build empires and watched those same empires negotiate their own slow endings, felt the hair along her arms rise. Not because it let one go. Because she understood, sitting there in the quiet of her station, why. Someone needed to carry the story back. She did not sleep that Tuesday. Part 2, What the Archives Do Not Say. The High Chamber of the Galactic Council met in emergency session, 11 days after Verath. As Siveth sat in the observer gallery and watched 41 species argue. The Duvari ambassador, a tall, gray-skinned diplomat named Counselor Vreth, opened with the position that the incident had been exaggerated in preliminary reports and that the humans had simply been lucky. He said this with the confidence of a species that had not watched the feed. Several others nodded. The Felosi ambassador, a small, dense creature called Ro who communicated primarily through a translation collar, said the word containment 3 times in the first 4 minutes. The mentoree delegate sat quietly and said nothing, which was unusual, because the mentoree always had something to say. In the back of the chamber, at the human delegation table, a woman named Claire Reyes was eating something from a small paper wrapper. She had been the human ambassador to the Galactic Council for 3 years. She attended every session. She sat in the back. She had, in 3 years, spoken formally on the floor exactly twice. Once to correct a trade registry error affecting a human shipping lane, and once to ask if the ventilation in the East Corridor could be adjusted because it was, in her words, unnecessarily cold. She was not eating the wrapper thing in a nervous way. She was eating it the way someone eats when they are waiting for a meeting to arrive at the part that actually matters. As Siveth watched her more than she watched the floor debate. The floor debate was going in circles. The Duvari wanted a review committee. The Felosi wanted a containment framework. The Lethani ambassador, representing a species that had spent 300 years developing a philosophy of radical non-intervention, said he believed the situation called for careful reflection. A younger delegate from the Sarath territories asked, reasonably, whether they should perhaps speak to the humans directly about what had happened. That suggestion was tabled. Nobody explained why. Nobody needed to. The chamber was doing what chambers do when confronted with something they do not have a category for. It was talking about everything except the thing itself. Then the mentoree delegate stood. His name was Golan. Siveth knew of him by reputation. 60 years as a senior archivist, the most respected xenobehavioral researcher in the council system. He had authored 42 formal studies on emerging species integration. He was 81 years old and moved like someone carrying a great deal more than his own weight. Councillor Vreth said with practiced courtesy, "Archivist Golan, the chamber welcomes your testimony." Golan stood at the speaking platform and looked at his own hands for a moment. Then he said, 11 years ago, I completed a behavioral analysis of the human species that I did not submit to the public registry." The chamber went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when someone has just handed the air a new temperature. Councillor Rowe's translation collar clicked. "You suppressed a council research document." "I delayed submission," Golan said. "I told myself the data set was incomplete." A pause. It was not incomplete. The chamber erupted. Sci-Fi stopped watching the floor and watched Reyes. Reyes had stopped eating. She was looking at Golan. Her expression was not surprise. It was something closer to the expression of a person who has heard a door open that they have been waiting a long time to hear open. It took 7 minutes for the chamber to settle enough for Golan to continue. The suppressed file, entered into the public record that morning, was titled Human Predator-Prey Neurological Matrix, with a subnotation that read, in mentory academic phrasing, recommend non-escalation in all engagement contexts. The file documented, with 60 years of observation data, a specific neurological and behavioral pattern that activated in humans under conditions of perceived threat to their social group. Golan called it a switching state. He described it in clinical terms. Sci-Fi appreciated the clinical terms because the clinical terms made it easier to hear. The switching state was not anger, he explained. Anger was a response. This was something older. It was the activation of an ancient survival architecture that humans still carried fully intact beneath everything civilization had built on top of it. Threat to the group was the trigger. The specific direction or origin of the threat did not matter. The size of the threat did not matter. What mattered was the group. Once the switching state activated, he said, the behavioral profile of an individual human changed in ways that were not reversible within the engagement window. He showed data. Sci-Fi watched the graphs. She thought about the human patrol craft moving to the rear of the Keth formation before the Keth had finished forming it. Rowe asked, "Why did you not submit this 11 years ago?" Golan looked at his hands again. Because the logical conclusion of the data was that we had spent 60 years classifying humans as cautious and non-expansionist, and the data said we had classified them based on what we could see. We had never asked what they were watching. Silence. "They were watching each other," he said. "They were always watching each other. We were not a threat to the group, so the switching state had no reason to activate toward us." Councillor Vreth said slowly, "Had no reason, past tense." Golan said nothing. Claire Ray stood up. She had not been recognized. She had not raised her hand. She stood up from the back of the chamber and the room let her, the way rooms let things happen when the alternative is pretending something is not already happening. She said, "You watched us for 200 years. You studied our wars, our stories, our history, and our science. Not one of you asked why every single children's story we have ever told ends with someone defeating the thing that came for the people they love." She did not raise her voice. She was not performing anything. "That is not aggression," she said. "That is architecture. It is the oldest thing we are." She sat back down. She picked up the paper wrapper. The chamber did not recover its previous rhythm after that. The debates continued, technically, but the shape of the room had changed. Sci-Fi could feel it. The mentory delegate returned to his seat looking like a man who had put down something heavy and was not sure whether he felt lighter or worse. Councillor Rowe had stopped saying the word containment. Even Councillor Vreth had gone quiet in the way that only very intelligent people go quiet when they realize they have been measuring something with the wrong instrument for a very long time. Sci-Fi looked at the file summary on her data pad. At the bottom of Golan's suppressed analysis, Past all the graphs and behavioral charts and clinical notation, there was a single concluding sentence. It had been written 11 years ago and then locked in an archive and never shown to anyone. It read, "The most significant question is not what humans will do when threatened. It is what they will do when the thing being threatened is not themselves." She looked at Reyes. Reyes was folding the paper wrapper into a very small square, with the careful focus of someone whose hands need something to do. Sci-Fi thought she understood then why Golan had not submitted the file. Not because he was afraid of what the council would do with the information. Because he was afraid of what the answer to that final question actually was. Part 3, Predator Memory. Vosh was not, by any measure, a foolish commander. He had raided 17 species in 20 years of active operations. He understood leverage. He understood that leverage was not about weapons or numbers or firepower. Leverage was about making the other side calculate that the cost of resistance was higher than the cost of giving you what you wanted. He had built a career on that calculation. He had never been wrong about it. He took the 3 scientists from the research post on Pelin IV on a Thursday. He was careful about it. He chose scientists, not soldiers. He kept them unharmed. He broadcast confirmation of their condition to every council-monitored channel within 6 hours. He issued his terms with a clear 72-hour window. He was, in his own estimation, being remarkably reasonable. He expected diplomats. He expected the council's standard response. Careful language, committees, a negotiating envoy with a counteroffer, a drawn-out process that would end with him getting roughly 70% of what he asked for and everyone going home. He had run this calculation before. It worked every time. What arrived at Pelin IV 14 hours after his broadcast was a single vessel. Vosh looked at its registry on his display and felt the first small movement of something he did not immediately name. The ship was listed as a survey craft, Vega class. The Vega class was not a military designation. It was a scientific and cartographic hull designed for long-range mapping in uninhabited systems. It had lighter armor than his personal escort ship. Its weapons array, according to the Council Public Registry, was rated for debris clearance and minor hazard response. 40 crew members. He had 300. His tactical officer, a young soldier named Prith, ran a full scan and filed a threat assessment rating the human vessel low risk. Vosh read it and agreed. He opened a hailing frequency. The human ship did not respond. It began moving around the station. Not toward it, around it. Slow, methodical arcs along the outer perimeter, each pass slightly different from the last, as if it were learning the shape of the place from every angle. Prith said, "They are mapping the station." Vosh said, "Why?" No one answered. The human ship completed 4 full passes over the next 2 hours. Vosh hailed it 6 times. The ship responded to none of them. It did not behave like a vessel preparing for a rescue attempt. It did not behave like a diplomatic envoy. It did not, in fact, behave like anything in Vosh's 20 years of experience. It just kept moving in those quiet, patient arcs, and there was something about the patience that made Vosh's throat dry. He told himself it was the uncertainty. He was very good at telling himself things. At hour 4, the human ship stopped moving. For 11 minutes, it simply held position off the station's secondary docking arm. Vosh stared at it on his display. His crew stared at it. The station was silent in the specific way that silence has texture and weight. Then the human ship moved, and it moved the way Sci-Fi's translator had failed to categorize at Verath. Not with the straight tactical lines of a military approach, but with a kind of practiced ease that suggested it had already decided every variable and was now simply executing a plan that had been finalized some time ago. What happened in the next 6 hours, Vosh would spend a long time afterward trying to describe accurately and would never quite manage it. Not because the details were unclear, because the details were completely clear, and that was the problem. Every decision the human team made was visible. Every movement could be tracked. There was no confusion about what was happening, and yet the sum of all those visible, trackable decisions was something that landed in the base of the stomach, rather than in the part of the brain that handles tactical analysis. The three scientists were recovered from secondary holding. The station's systems were, somehow, not breached but rather talked to, coaxed into cooperation by a human crew member who sat at an external access panel for 40 minutes, with the focused expression of someone doing a puzzle they have done before. Vosh's interior security response was redirected twice, not by force, but by the appearance of humans already being exactly where the security team was going next. Prith filed a second threat assessment at hour 5. He left the risk rating field blank. When it was over, Vosh was alive, restrained, and sitting on the floor of his own command deck. He was not harmed. His crew was not harmed. His ship was operational. He had been left, deliberately, with every resource he needed to leave the system under his own power. The human team lead crouched in front of him. Her name, Vosh would learn later, was Kate Dryden. She was not especially large. She was not physically intimidating in any way that the eye could immediately measure. She had a scar along one side of her jaw that she had clearly carried for years and that she had never had repaired, which was its own kind of statement to anyone paying attention. She looked at him with an expression that his translator offered 3 different words for, and that none of those words fit properly. She spoke to him in a language he didn't have. His translator rendered it as an approximation. She was not threatening him. She was not angry. She was explaining something in the tone of a person who explains a thing to someone they expect to eventually understand it, even if not today. She stood up, she walked away. Her team followed her. They did not hurry. Prith watched them dock and undock and leave the system, and then he sat at his station for a long time. He was 24 years old. He had never filed a blank risk assessment in his 3 years of service. He had a solid record, a careful mind, and an instinct for tactical evaluation that his commanding officers had praised more than once. He looked up the word his translator had offered as an approximation for Kate Dryden's expression. He read the definition. He resigned his commission the following week. When his commanding officer asked why, he said only that he had looked something up and decided he wanted to make different choices about what he did with his time. His commanding officer, who had also seen the footage from Pelin IV, did not press him on it. In the station's archive feed, reviewed afterward by council behavioral analysts, the 11 minutes the human ship had spent motionless off the docking arm were logged simply as a hold position interval. The analysts noted, in their report, that the ship's sensor array had been active at maximum range for the entire 11 minutes. It had been watching every exit. All of them. At the same time. The analyst who wrote the report added one personal note at the bottom, outside the formal documentation, in small text that suggested she had not originally intended to include it. In 40 years of work, I have studied 63 spacefaring species. I have never observed a hold position interval that felt, for lack of a more scientific term, like a decision being honored. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Part 4. The chamber asks the wrong question. 30 days after Pelin IV, the high chamber was still asking the wrong question. Sci-Fi sat in the observer gallery and listened to it happen. The question on the floor, in one form or another, across 4 separate sessions and hundreds of hours of debate, was always the same. What do we do about humans? It was a reasonable question. It was asked in good faith by intelligent delegates from 41 species who had genuinely invested centuries in building something that functioned. Sci-Fi understood why they kept asking it. She also understood, with increasing clarity, that it was the wrong question, and that the right question was sitting in the back of the room, eating a granola bar and waiting. The Duvari, pragmatic as always, had run the numbers. Councillor Vreth had spent 30 days with his advisors building a case for a human military advisory role, an arrangement by which human tactical assets would be formally integrated into the Council's outer reach defense framework. He presented it as enlightened self-interest. Sci-Fi thought it was enlightened self-interest. She also thought Vreth had not fully absorbed what he was proposing, which was to take the thing that had cleared a 12-ship raider formation in 23 minutes and point it at problems. The Felosi still wanted containment. Ro had found new ways to say the word, but the word was still the word. The Lethani wanted careful reflection, as they always did, which was a philosophical position Siveth respected, and which was also, in this particular context, not especially useful. The Mentory delegation had been quiet since Golan's testimony. Golan himself attended sessions but did not speak. He sat near the front and watched everything with the expression of a man working through a mathematics problem that keeps producing an answer he did not expect. Claire Reyes attended every session. She sat in the back. She said nothing. On the 31st day, Siveth was called to testify. She had prepared notes. She set them aside when she reached the speaking platform because she found she did not need them. What she needed was honesty, and honesty did not require notes. Counselor Vreth asked her, as the only council observer who had watched the Verath engagement in real time, to describe the experience for the formal record. She described it. She was precise. She used the correct technical terminology. She described the tactical sequence, the timeline, the behavioral anomalies the analysis software had flagged. She was a good observer and she gave a good account. Then Vreth asked, "Were you frightened?" Siveth considered the question. Not because she was uncertain of the answer, but because the answer had a shape she wanted to describe accurately, and shape takes a moment to find the right words for. "No," she said, "I was frightened before, when I thought they were like us." The chamber was quiet. Vreth said carefully, "Could you explain what you mean by that?" "The behavioral profile in our registry," she said, "classified humans as cautious and community-oriented. I had read that profile. I had found it reassuring. When I watched the engagement at Verath, I was not frightened because I was in danger. I was frightened because I understood, watching it, that we had built our sense of safety on a description that was true in the same way that describing an ocean as wet is true, technically accurate, completely inadequate." She paused. "We measured what was calm on the surface and called it the whole thing." She looked briefly at Reyes. Reyes gave her a small nod. Counselor Vreth noticed the exchange and his expression shifted in a way he clearly did not intend to be visible. The questioning continued for another hour. Other delegates asked other questions. All of them were versions of the same question. What are humans? What do humans want? What will humans do? At the end of the session, before the chamber recessed, Reyes stood up without being recognized for the second time. No one stopped her. She said, "I want to address the central question that this chamber has been asking for 30 days. She paused. "You have been asking what to do about humans, whether to contain us, integrate us, or formalize us. You have been treating us as a variable in your existing system that needs to be assigned a value." She looked around the room slowly. "That is the wrong question, and I think at least some of you already know it." Vreth said, "Ambassador Reyes, what would you suggest is the right question?" "Why are you safe?" she said. The room held that. Not theoretically, not diplomatically, genuinely, you have the data now. You have watched what we did at Verath and Pelin IV. You have read Golan's analysis. You understand what the switching state is and what activates it. She let a moment pass. "So the real question is, why has none of it been aimed at you?" Nobody answered. "Because you are inside the lines," she said. 200 years ago, humans were in conflict with each other over borders that fit inside a single planet. Then contact happened. The lines moved. They always move. They moved to include every species in this chamber. And that happened gradually and without an announcement. And most of you did not notice it because you were busy studying our wars and classifying our temperament as cautious." She looked at Golan. Golan looked at his hands. "You are inside them now," she said. "That is the whole answer. That is the reason you are safe. Not because we are controlled, not because we are contained, not because of any framework this chamber could design, because you are ours, not property, not subjects. The word does not translate cleanly into any language I have found in this registry. She picked up the paper wrapper from the table. The word in English is family, she said. You can keep debating what to do about us, or you can ask a better question. She sat down. The chamber did not recess on schedule. It sat in something that was not silence and was not conversation for several minutes, and during those minutes, Sci-Fi watched the faces of 41 species process something they had not prepared for. Counselor Rowe, who had advocated loudest and longest for containment, turned in his seat and looked at the outer docking ring visible through the chamber's observation port. Docked there for 3 years was the human military vessel assigned to escort the human diplomatic delegation. Sci-Fi had passed it every day she came to session. Everyone had. It was simply there, registered, accounted for, part of the background. She watched Rowe look at it. She watched him understand, all at once, what she had understood weeks ago. The ship had not been there to guard the human delegation. Nobody had ever asked it to be there. Nobody had to. Part 5. What predators do with their own. The alert came in at 300 station time, on a Thursday that nobody would forget. The Vreth. Sci-Fi was asleep when her emergency channel opened, and she was fully awake before the second word came through, because the Vreth were not a word that allowed gradual waking. 4 centuries old, and she had spent a significant portion of those years hopping, she would never hear that word used in present tense. The Vreth were in the history files under headings like unresolved and ongoing, and the Council's standing recommendation, unchanged in 400 years of documentation, was evacuation and early negotiation. Not because the Vreth were invincible, because the price of finding out if they weren't was too high. They had moved on a Thren colony. Sci-Fi's home system. She was dressed and moving before she registered the physical sensation in her chest. It was not a thing she examined. There was no time. The high chamber convened at 3:40. For once, the room reached quorum in under 10 minutes. Evacuation protocols were already drafted. The language was calm, procedural, and deeply familiar, because this was the playbook. This was what 4 centuries of careful documentation had concluded was the only rational response to a Vreth engagement. Claire Reyes was not in the back of the chamber. Reyes was not in the chamber at all. Sci-Fi noticed the empty table during the second procedural reading and felt something move through her that she could not name until she was already moving toward the docking level. She did not announce she was leaving. She simply left. The chamber was well into the evacuation framework and would not miss an observer. In the docking bay, Golan was already there. He was standing at the observation rail, looking down at the lower berths, and what he was watching had stopped his feet entirely. Sci-Fi came up beside him and looked. The human escort vessel, the one that had been docked there for 3 years, was fully lit. Every system active, crew at stations, and already in the process of clearing its berth with the quiet efficiency of a vessel that had been ready for this for a long time. As she watched, a second ship came in on the approach corridor from the outer transit lane. No council registry signal. No identification broadcast. It docked without requesting clearance, simply finding its berth and settling into it, and it was followed 7 minutes later by a third, and then 2 more. None of them matched any ship class in the public registry. They came in like they knew exactly where they were going. Because they did. Sci-Fi looked for Reyes and found her below on the docking floor, moving between the new arrivals with a team around her. Not hurrying, talking to people she clearly knew, checking things she had clearly already thought about. She was dressed differently than she was in chambers. She moved differently, not harder or colder, more settled, more completely herself, the way that some people are most completely themselves when something is genuinely required of them. Golan said quietly, "How many ships?" Sci-Fi counted, 11 so far. He was quiet for a moment. The Council's assessment says the Vreth fleet at the Thren colony numbers at least 40 vessels. Sci-Fi said nothing. Golan gripped the observation rail. This is not rational. The numbers are not favorable. Sci-Fi watched Ray's stop to speak to a crew member, a young man named Owen Hartley who could not have been more than 25, who listened to whatever she said and nodded and went back to his work with the expression of someone who has just been given a task they intend to complete. She watched another team member, a woman whose name she did not know, laugh at something a colleague said while running a pre-flight check, and the laugh was real, not performative, and that was the detail that settled something in Sci-Fi's chest. She said they heard. Golan turned to look at her. That is the only thing that happened, she said. They heard. That is the complete explanation. At 600, the human fleet, 14 ships now, left Verath Station. The council chamber was still in session. The evacuation framework was on its third revision. The departure of 14 ships was logged by the automated system as a routine traffic event. Sci-Fi went back to the observation post and opened a feed. She watched for 9 hours. She had lived 4 centuries. She had watched species engage in conflicts that spanned decades. She had once observed a 3-year siege campaign between the Duvari and a territorial challenger, documented it thoroughly, and considered it one of the most comprehensive military operations she had ever recorded. She had frameworks for understanding how fleets engaged. She had a professional vocabulary for it. None of it applied to what she watched. It was not that the human fleet was doing something impossible. Every individual action, examined alone, could be explained. The Vreth had a formation vulnerability on their starboard deep flank, a structural gap that existed because no force had ever had both the speed and the precision to exploit it before it closed. The human fleet exploited it in the first 20 minutes. When the Vreth adapted, the human fleet adapted before the adaptation finished completing. When the Vreth split their formation to close 2 angles simultaneously, the human ships separated, handled each angle, and rejoined faster than the Vreth's own split had taken. It was not supernatural. It was not miraculous. It was 9 hours of the most focused, continuous, adaptive work she had ever watched any species perform. And the word that kept arriving in her mind, the word she kept setting aside because it seemed too simple and too large at the same time, was relentless. Not cruel, not cold. Relentless in the way that a river is relentless, which is to say it was not angry at the rocks. At hour 7, with 12 Vreth vessels disabled and the rest of the fleet in early withdrawal patterns, Sci-Fi heard Ray's voice come over the open human channel. Not to the council, not to the Vreth, to her own people. The translator gave her, "Come home safe." 3 words. Sci-Fi sat with those 3 words for a long time. The Vreth retreated fully at hour 9, not scattered, retreating in formation, organized, carrying their damaged ships. They would be back, eventually. Sci-Fi knew that. The chamber would have a great deal to say about it. There would be sessions and frameworks and revised protocols and debates about what this meant for the balance of power in the outer reaches. All of that was true, and all of it could wait. She sat in the quiet of the observation post, and the feed was clear, and the star field was still, and she thought about the question Vreth had asked her, whether she had been frightened. She had told the truth. She had been frightened before, when she thought they were like everyone else. She was not frightened now. She was something she had not been in a very long time. She had to go back through decades of memory to find the last time she had felt it, and when she found it, it was in her own home system. At a very young age, before the complications of 4 centuries of careful professional distance. She was safe. Not because the Vreth were gone, not because the tactical situation had resolved, not because of anything the council had decided or any framework that had been approved by committee vote. Because out in the star field, 14 ships were turning back. And nobody had asked them to go. And nobody had needed to.